So let's talk a little COVID. Not much different from last week, um, but a couple of things I wanted to touch on. So I just thought I'd give the overview slide of what's going on with the legal challenges behind the vaccine mandates, just so everybody's clear. There is a fourth one, which is what's going on with federal employees, but that obviously doesn't affect our members. So the OSHA ETS, that was the 100 plus employers, the vaccine or test requirement that's blocked by the US Supreme Court. More on that in a second. The mandate for healthcare workers is in effect per the recent Supreme Court ruling, and the federal contractor vaccine mandate is on hold. The expectation was that we'd have something from the 11th Circuit on this by the end of January, but clock's ticking on that. So let's see what happens. Maybe we'll have something by the end of by the next town hall, potentially. So with regard to the ETS, I gave you this slide last week, but the same statement remains on OSHA's website, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I did bold a couple of pieces here that I think are significant. Employers are responsible for the safety of their workers, and OSHA will do everything in its existing authority to hold businesses accountable for protecting workers. And with that, what we're seeing is a surge in complaints to OSHA that are COVID related. So as of January 17th, and that's a few days ago, OSHA had received 702 complaints and referrals from other government agencies regarding OSHA issues, regarding COVID type issues in the workplace. And back in November, before we had this current Omicron outbreak, OSHA was averaging about 70 complaints and referrals a week. So as you can imagine, there's been a spike in complaints. Starting in mid-December, the numbers increased each week, OSHA receiving 233 complaints and referrals in the final week of December. So we're seeing more activity, and obviously that's what's going to federal OSHA. I'm sure there are complaints going to state OSHA, going to state departments of health. Doesn't mean that your employees are calling and telling on you, but it's certainly something to think about. And you do have an obligation as an employer to provide a safe workplace. So what are you doing to control that? So what should you be thinking about? I've been saying it since vaccines have been available. I think you should find out if your employees are vaccinated. I talk to members about COVID issues almost every day. And one of the questions I always ask is, do you know what percentage of your workplace is vaccinated? Have you gotten proof? I would say most employers are doing this, but a handful still are not. A handful maybe and maybe have not asked the question at all because they don't want to know the answer. And then a handful have relied sort of on the honor system, which, I think we've all been in situations where we understand that we're going to get some employees in every workplace who are not going to be completely honest with us. So I do think it makes sense to collect cards. Do you want to issue a vaccine mandate? We have plenty of members who have done that, who did it before everything happened with the ETS, who are rolling forward now that the ETS is blocked. I was just talking to a member in the last couple of days about working through the logistics of their mandate. So when you talk about some big firms or big companies who are looking at this, Honeywell, for example, moving forward with their mandate. GE and Starbucks put their mandates on hold. Citigroup had a mandate in place regardless of what was going on with the ETS. And by the end of this month, it looks like they're set to fire their unvaccinated employees in their offices, not in their branches. So be curious to see if that happens. Keep in mind that even though the government attempts at vaccine mandates have, not been largely successful, the lawsuits have gone so far in favor of private employers who have mandates. As long as you have a good health and safety reason, might have an issue if all of your employees are remote. But if you have employees who are coming to an office, if you have employees who deal with the public, you're probably pretty safe as an employer to issue a vaccine mandate. You've got to have something in there that allows for reasonable accommodation for disability and religious reasons. That does not mean that automatically, just because someone raises a medical issue or someone raises a religious issue, that they get exempted from the vaccine and they get to work as normal. It means you go through an interactive process and you figure out what to do with those folks. And it's very individualized. And if you happen upon that, consult with counsel. What about requiring boosters? It doesn't appear that CDC is going to change the definition of fully vaccinated, but I do think that if, as an employer, if you're going to require the vaccine, why not go ahead and require a booster as well? And if you're not going to have a mandate, again, obligation to provide a safe workplace, you really should be at least encouraging vaccination. Back to that sort of carrot and stick discussion we had before. I was just talking to a member yesterday who said they put a bunch of, they put encouragement in place, bonuses in place to get people vaccinated, and it worked pretty well for them. voluntary vaccination, encouraging vaccination, or mandatory vaccination, makes sense to have that in place, distribute it to your employees, be available to ask questions. And one of the ways that you encourage vaccination is giving time off to get vaccinated. The ETS gives us a pretty good guide. It was time off to get the shot and then time off 2 days to recover from any after effects. So that could give you a guide. When you're also thinking about your safe workplace, are you masking right now? There were plenty of places who were not masking, and then Omicron came along and they've started masking again. There are plenty of other places who never stopped masking, especially workplaces where you have people working in fairly close quarters. Who should be masked? I would say everybody at this point, not just the unvaccinated. But what are you thinking about? Is it in all spaces? Is it just public spaces? If you have employees who work in private offices, they don't need to be masked while they're sitting alone at their desks, but pretty much everybody else, when they're in public spaces or if they're close to other people, should be masked. Should be mandatory or voluntary. I think if you're going to do it, make it mandatory. And what about for visitors? Well, if your employees are masked, I think your visitors should be masked as well. But the things you need to think about is your density. How easily is it to socially distance? How much interaction do your employees have with each other? How much interaction do they have with the public? And what percentage of your workplace is vaccinated? Does that make a difference? Are you requiring regular testing? Do you have a handle on how sick your employee population is potentially, even if people are symptomatic or asymptomatic? And then of course, the employees who refuse to wear their masks, refuse to wear them correctly. That is a decision that you need to make as an organization. You can't really put it on your managers, on your HR people to be the mask police, and you're going to support them in that. And what does that look like? Does that mean we're going to do progressive discipline, and after a certain number of violations, we're potentially going to terminate somebody? You need to make that decision at the top and be consistent about it. You can't just discipline the employees we don't like. That's how we get ourselves in trouble with regard to discrimination claims. And then, of course, the idea of COVID testing, the ETS was going to be vaccine or test. But do you want to be testing your employees? And who do you test? Do you test everybody, just the unvaccinated? That gets potentially very expensive and very burdensome very quickly if you're testing a large portion of your population. Do you just test for travel purposes? You have employees who travel, we test them before they go, we test them when they come back. And then what type of testing? The self-testing is, the home testing is getting much more available. But then the question is, even though it's easier, even though it's cheaper, probably not quite as accurate, but I think they're getting more and more accurate. How do you trust people to take their tests and to give you the results? I was just having this conversation with my college student who's headed back today, and her university has been very stringent about testing, but they've just moved to self-testing. And it's a complete honor system. You only report a positive test. So the conversation was, are there people who just aren't going to test, or are there people who aren't going to report positive tests? And I think you need to think that's going to happen in virtually every population. So what do? Do you watch the folks take the test? Do you watch the folks read the result of the test? What do you do? That's what the ETS had said. The ETS could be self-administered, but you need to, either employer or a healthcare provider needs to watch either the taking of the test or the reading of the test, or possibly both. So what do you do there? Who pays for the testing? Again, there are a handful of states, I think about 20 actually, states that have some sort of statute on the books that is suggestive that the employer should be paying for the testing. Pennsylvania does have a law, but it's a little bit ambiguous. Doesn't appear so far that most Pennsylvania employers think that they need to pay for the test. But even if you don't have to pay for the test, are you really going to ask your employees to pay for testing? Because that's a significant expense for them as well, and might, with everything going on with recruitment and retention, may just be another reason for them to move on if you're asking them to pay for testing. One thing that's pretty clear, if your non-exempt employees or hourly employees are testing, you as the employer are paying for that time. I mentioned this last week. Some of the large employment law firms are tracking litigation. So international law firm Littler says since March of 2020, almost 5,000 lawsuits filed against employers related to COVID and employment-related issues. So about 2,500 of those include a claim for retaliation. It's not always the crime, it's the cover-up, right? So we really need to think about when employees are asking for reasonable accommodations around COVID, how are we reacting to that? We need to remember that COVID, just having COVID can be a disability, or long haul COVID can be a disability. And we need to, like I said, react to reasonable accommodation concerns appropriately. What might that mean? It could mean you're getting ready to come back to the office and you have an employee who has an underlying condition, you have an employee who has COVID-related anxiety and they don't want to come back to the office. You can't just, that's not an automatic no. You need to go through an interactive process with those folks and figure out whether or not you can reasonably accommodate them. I'm keeping these slides in because I just think they're helpful, but I'm not going to go through them. CDC had a relatively recent update on their isolation guidance and their exposure guidance. So if you don't have these policies in writing, what happens when an employee has COVID, what happens when an employee has an exposure, you can use these slides to create a policy around that to make sure you're clear what happens with employees. And then a really big question going on right now. I just saw some recent survey data that the share of adults not working due to COVID-related conditions jumped 1.2% in December to 3.5% in January. That's significant. And there was a really nice conversation going on in the MEA community platform yesterday about what do we do about people, it's January 25th, and we've got employees who have already burned through all their time off for the year because of COVID-related conditions. What do we do about that? Do we give them more PTO? Do we let them take unpaid time off? What do we do? We certainly want to encourage our sick employees to stay home. It's much easier if your employees can work from home. Everybody gets a laptop. Every night you take the laptop home, you wake up and you don't feel well, work from home today. Much more complicated for our manufacturing members or folks who really need to be in person to do their jobs in any way. Do we require a negative test to return? Do we require a doctor's note to return? Generally speaking, CDC has said no on the negative test. Someone with COVID, even when they're recovered from their symptoms, even when they're really no longer contagious, can test positive for weeks and weeks. So the negative test is probably a no. Doctor's note, same thing. I think it's so hard for employees to get into to see their healthcare providers right now. There are plenty of healthcare providers who won't see you in person if you have COVID symptoms. They will maybe do a telehealth appointment. So I think putting that burden on your employees is maybe problematic, and you really just want to go ahead and follow CDC guidance. All right. What do we have as far as questions?
Oh, sorry. I believe the question is not the ETS, but just generally under OSHA, if you could remind people what the reporting requirements. I believe it's a transmission within the workplace.
Yeah, there is, and I apologize because I have not read up on those relatively recently, but there is a requirement to report to OSHA. I can put that in next week's town hall.
But again, I think it's a very limited requirement because it has to do with transmission within the workplace. It's not just
yeah. And I was just having a conversation with a member this morning. They have an employee who sent an email that said, "I think I got COVID at a work-related event." But how do you know? That I think that causation is really, really tough, especially now. We're not in lockdown anymore. People are out and about. It's very, very hard to say for sure that somebody got COVID at work.
I think that's it. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed today's topic, and we look forward to having you join us next week. Take care.